Chapter 24, Living the Funk. Living in South Central, an environment that made it difficult to be a dreamer with idyllic views. I didn't have the cerebral stability usually found in hope. I lived in a mental funk, craving salvation, but the Crip God denied me reprieve from my hell. I was dying a slow death with no purpose or legitimate cause worthy of such a sacrifice. Though I'd boldly challenge any gang rival, I shied away from revolting against the conditions I allowed to dominate my past, present, and future. I was a total mess. My life soundtrack was P-Funk, music that was notable for funkadelic phase of musical madness, drugs, sex, and urban violence. Popular funk artists like Bootsy Collins, the Ohio Players, Rick James, the Barclays, and the greatest of all funksters, Parliament, reigned supreme in South Central Los Angeles. Parliament was going to appear at the Inglewood Forum, and most Crips I knew were pumped up for the concert. Prior to the performance, Parliament drove through South Central in a green limousine, amazing the residents. Though everybody else was looking forward to being entertained, I was preparing to be seen. The evening concert was so packed that Jackie and I had to park several blocks away from the Forum. Myself and others had devised ways of gaining free admission in the concerts. If we were unable to rip a door off its hinges, then somebody would jimmy a door. Or in this case, one person paid to get in and then open the side door. Inside the building, there were wall-to-wall women, while speakers blasted Marvin Gaye's "Gotta Give It Up." When the time was right, Jamel and I started strolling around the Forum with our shirts off before crowds of people shouting, "Tookie, Jamel." During our post routine, the crowd began to chant, "Go to the stage, go to the stage." We descended parallel sideways toward the center stage. Abruptly, the lights were cut off, the music stopped, and the Parliament's mothership, a replication of a spaceship, was lowered onto the stage. Though our unscheduled performance rocked the house, we were upstaged as Parliament tore the roof off the sucker. From musical funk to a funked up situation, Jackie and I were evicted from the duplex for refusing to pay rent because of a serious roof problem. Jackie moved in with his sister Gloria and brother Joey, and I drifted like a nomad. Other than a razor, toiletries, and a few clothes in the trunk of my car, I left the bulk of my clothing at my mother's and Fred's apartment off La Cienega. As for the weights, Sweetback suggested that I talk to James and Esther Garrett about storing my weights in their garage. They agreed, and I unloaded more than 3,000 pounds of weights, dumbbells, squat racks, and 5 different heavyweight machine benches. The Garretts told me I had access to their garage anytime, or if need be, their home was open to me. They were seemingly friendly people, willing to help. None of us suspected that they were agent provocateurs, snitches. Plus, I didn't know the Garretts had informed on Juice and Hillbilly. Being smoked out, I had long since lost my edge to detect a snitch when no one else could. The Garretts managed to snake their way around without exposure while plotting nefarious schemes with anyone seeking to make a buck. Then later, they would turn the unsuspecting friend into the cops. Loaded or not, I managed to drive iron with consistency. Between workouts, I crip walked around with my chest stuck out, playing a man of indomitable posture with my trusted stepbrother and sidekick Wayne, sometimes known as Little Tookie. Wayne was shorter than Napoleon Bonaparte, but his mid-cap exploits elevated his stature. When we were there, we made the Coolie Cools apartments a terrible place to be. Only women, children, and other Crips were exempt from our hostile greed. With sick insolence, we caught a lone dealer before he could hide his drugs, which were several jars of wet sherms. Wayne was supposed to search the dude for a weapon, but being loaded, he did a sloppy job. When we turned to walk away with the loot, the guy whipped out a gun and I heard it click several times. It had misfired, unfortunately for him, which caused him to become a human punching bag at our hands. I lived my life looking through the lens of a movie camera, seeing a caricature of myself, going through the motions, with an impersonal existence. I can't recall why, but one day John, former Compton Crip turned Westside Crip, broached the subject. He asked, if you had to pick between death row or life in prison, which one would you choose? Without thinking, I nonchalantly said, death row. Looking bemused, he said, why death row, big homie? Oddly, I forgot to mention having already envisioned myself being in the death row cell, sitting in Rodden's thinking man position. John's eyes lit up as he smiled, then said, "That's deep, cuz. But this," he pulled out a wet sherm wrapped in aluminum foil, "is deeper." I was already living the funk. By no stretch of the imagination could I conceive any crip or acquaintance conspiring with the cops against me. Such Shakespearean intrigue only happened in the movies. I was susceptible to being blindsided. Trusting people would be my undoing. In 1979, I met Samuel at the Workshop Club on Western. Jamel and I were semi-bouncers at the club and were given free passes inside, provided my homeboys maintained their composure. On a particular evening, Samuel and a handful of his cronies tried to bully their way through the side door of the club, which I stopped immediately. His expression told me he was shocked. Under the streetlight, I could see Samuel for the first time. If looks could kill, he could have murdered my entire army, dressed in all black with hand gloves and dark shades to match. His ensemble mimicked the movie character Shaft. Samuel was about 5 feet 10 inches, dark-skinned and muscular, with a manicured afro. He had unique features resembling a swarthy monitor lizard, with a fierce grimace that alone probably won many battles. He had an unforgettable mug. When I stepped from the club onto the sidewalk, Samuel's posture was begging for a right jab, and I was positioning myself to do just that. Stepping into full view under the light, I heard a few of his homeboys acknowledge loudly, "Hey, wait a minute, cuz, that's Big Took." Immediately, there were smiles and C handshakes, thumb and forefinger made to form a C, then connecting with someone else's forefinger. And even Samuel had a toothy grin. While introducing themselves as Harlan Crips, somebody from behind us hollered out, "What's the problem, cuz?" A small crowd of West Side Crips approached John out front doing the Crip walk. Being a showman, he said, "I hope I don't have to get physical here." It was hilarious because John weighed no more than $150. After introductions, a few of us caravaned to other parties in the jungle, then to an after-hours club off Crenshaw and Adams. When we arrived, there were cars and people all over the place. I bumped into my stepfather, Fred, a professional photographer who worked concerts, fashion shows, professional fights, weddings, clubs, and premieres, among other events. I was trying my best to stay out of his view because my homeboys and I were acting like complete fools. Back then, the After Hours Club on Adams was a predator's paradise for us Crips, with an abundance of women, drug users, and suppliers. Sometimes sitting in Samuel's black Chrysler car, blowing our minds off with Sherm, he complained about not getting the respect he deserved while crocodile tears flowed down his face. I thought the most ugly thing was a man bawling like a baby. I'd humor Samuel, also known as Capone, by telling him, "Cuz, you have to start acting mean and crazy like the real Al Capone." Other times I say, "Look at me, I'm Tookie. I attack first and ask questions later. You're Capone, so be Capone and stop all this boo-hooing." Using Sherm seemed to affect each person differently, but for me, aggression was always up front. One sunny afternoon, while driving down Adams and getting high, Samuel spotted 2 dudes he had a run-in with a few days before. I told him to pull over, and then I bailed out of the car. One of them ran off, but the chubbier of the two was a bit too slow. He received the brunt of my physical rage. With a beaming grin and no remorse, I Crip walked away and got back into the car. Samuel sped off, shaking his head, stammering, "Man, I didn't expect that, Tookie. You are crazy." That was music to my ears. Being viewed as maniacal or whacked out fed my ego. With my brainwashed mindset, I felt unstoppable, unbeatable, lawless, fearless of God, and irresistible to women. For over a decade, I had been driven by self-hate, eating me up like streptococcus, consuming an inch of human flesh a minute. Had I run into someone who acted like me, I would have peeled his cap without hesitation. My blue rage was now mimicking Buddha's. I believed my quest for money and drugs was the only way, but failed to realize my poverty transcended the physical. It was a state of mind that shackled me, rendering me incapable of emancipating myself. Damn near everybody I knew was the psychological captive of poverty. Further, I was unable to evacuate these ugly premises. Where could I go? During the worst moments, I drive down to Santa Monica Beach to sit with my bare feet under the sand and stare out in the distance. Under a starry sky with the comfort of a cool breeze, the demon of anxiety was held at bay. There were no deep thoughts during those moments. It was a high of a different kind. I sensed the finale of some kind coming. Like a madman, I was on the move, crisscrossing throughout the west to the east side hood of the Q102 Street Crips. I hung out there with Frog and company, or D-Dog and the JDs. Other times I'd show up at the PJs in the wee hours of the morning to visit Beverly and our son Stan. Though she welcomed me with open arms, I wouldn't blame her or Bonnie if they resented me for being absent, for drifting in and out of their lives. Watching my son Stan playing on the carpet, I knew that any of the four Watching my son stand playing on the carpet, I knew that any effort to reconcile would be too late. It felt the same way when I was with my older son Trevon, whom I drove to school occasionally in a pitiful attempt to play father. In a moronic haze of drugs, I was seeking redemption for abandoning my children. The world was closing in on me. Cruising in a recently purchased two-door gold two-door 1974 Fiat, I was game for anything. Driving down Hoover Street, I spotted Bulldog with a voluptuous female. He was limping badly, having been shot in the leg, and was using a walking cane. Inside my car, I whipped out aluminum foil with the Sherm inside, and Glenda's face lit up as she made a wink-wink gesture. I had high expectations about what was going to happen between Glenda and me that afternoon. In front of the shabby house off Broadway, a lot of Hoover Crips were outside driving iron or standing around getting high. We entered the house and I sat at the kitchen table, kicking it with Devil. I heard Glenda call me, then motion for me to follow her. Inside the bedroom, we sat on the end of the bed and talked for a few minutes, then started kissing. After, I pulled out a Sherm and took a few puffs and handed it to Glenda, who had already slipped out of her khaki suit to reveal a leopard ensemble. Maybe it was because I was loaded, but she looked like the poster on the wall, an African warrior kneeling beside her man. I watched as Glenda took long drags on the Sherm, then asked if I was going to undress. As I took off my khaki shirt, Glenda's eyes looked as if they were about to pop out of their sockets. She started screaming. I almost panicked, thinking my yolks had melted or something. But when I looked in the mirror, I saw nothing amiss. This chick had to be crazy. Seconds later, Bulldog burst into the room, asking Glenda what was wrong. Cowering under a bedspread, she continued trembling and screaming as if she had seen a ghost or monster. Furious, I left the room and went outside to sit on the porch. Minutes later, Bulldog came out and sat beside me. He mentioned how Glenda had a tendency to trip out when she smoked Sherm. I said, "That's an understatement." Bulldog went on to say, "You won't believe it, Tookie. She hallucinated that your veins had turned into snakes and your yolks were about to explode." Every Crip standing outside burst into laughter except me. Several hours later, when Glenda asked if I could drive her home and spend time with her, I angrily declined. I left the house and returned that evening with Chris and Opa's young son. Frank, who kept pestering me to let him ride with us. At the Crip house, I kicked it for a while with Hoover Crip Commander T.S. and drove a little iron. I came back to Jack, a drug dealer in the area, along with a couple other Hoovers, but the guy's stash turned out to be quite low. Disappointed, I returned to the house, snatched up the dude who gave us the bunk info, and dragged him outside by the collar to the back of my car. I popped the trunk, pulled out my pump, jammed it in his mouth, and told him not to move. I launched into a holier-than-thou lecture about the perils of lying to us, and especially to me. I was flying high as a rocket, but my intent was to put the fear of the Crip God in them. A large crowd of Crips had gathered outside to observe this bizarre spectacle. A smiling T.S. advanced to the front and appealed to me to spare the guy further humiliation or worse. Removing my weapon, I kicked him to the ground nodding to TS and the other Crips. I got in my car, threw up the Crip sign, and sped off. It would be over a decade before I seen TS again. My role as protector continued to be called upon. My stepsister and her man, Alan, were having problems with some fools who mistook their apartment for a dope house. Although they were told differently, the troublemakers continued to harass them and threaten bodily harm. For 2 evenings straight, I camped outside the dusk till dawn, waiting to ambush the culprits, who wisely didn't come. James's son, Little James, contacted me about bullets flying through their windows. I rushed over to protect them and their visiting nieces and nephews, and I hung around watching over them. The drive-bys ended as quickly as they started. When I told James that I had to leave, he begged me to give him my 12-gauge shotgun for safekeeping. I agreed and told him I'd check in periodically. I didn't know that the drive-bys were retaliation for James having set up Juice and Hillbilly.